A bell tolled somewhere in the fog, low and mournful, as if marking the hour when truth dared not speak. In the heart of London's diplomacy and deceit, something sacred was stolen. Not gold, not blood, but belief itself. Secrets whispered in chapels, shadows hidden in collars, and a prayer that may have been a lie from the very start. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a dreary morning in late October that I found myself once again at our Baker Street lodgings, the windows veiled by a thin mist that clung to the panes like gauze. Holmes sat motionless by the hearth, his eyes fixed not upon the fire, but some abstraction beyond it. The usual litter of tobacco and monographs lay undisturbed, and even his violin, which he so often tortured in moments of boredom, remained silent. There was about him an air of such profound quietude that I hesitated to disturb it, fearing to interrupt a mind in deep fermentation. "Today's paper speaks of fresh disturbances in Lisbon," I remarked, glancing over the columns of the Times. "A diplomatic aide vanished, and certain whispers of treason within the embassy." Holmes murmured non-committally. He did not stir. I continued, "But the article ends rather ominously. A priest was seen leaving by the private gate, but none could name him." Holmes lifted his head slightly, the faintest gleam stirring in his eye. "Now that," he said, "is interesting." Just then, Mrs. Hudson entered with a single envelope upon a tray. "No name, sir. It came by boy." Holmes took it, broke the seal with a flick of his thumbnail, and extracted a square of fine cream paper. His brow arched. "What does it say?" I asked. He handed it to me without a word. In neat, slanted script were the words, "He wears the cloth, but not the conscience." There was no signature, no address, only that one sentence. Holmes leaned back. "A riddle, Watson, and one cloaked in cassock and motive." He examined the note again, lifting it toward the morning light. Heavy pen pressure. The nib is slightly blunted, perhaps used frequently, but not recently replaced. The ink is Portuguese violet, not common. And this paper, ecclesiastical parchment, a church registry perhaps. "Someone from the clergy?" I asked. "Or someone pretending to be," Holmes murmured. "A man who hides behind symbols often forgets how revealing they can be." His eyes gleamed now. The fog outside remained, but within Holmes, the weather had changed. Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson reappeared. "There's a gentleman to see you, sir. Says it's urgent. A Father Silver." "Show him in," Holmes said briskly. Moments later, a slight man entered, clad in a black cassock that hung awkwardly upon his frame. He moved with a hesitancy not born of piety, but of watchfulness. His spectacles were tinted, and his hat clutched too tightly in his hands. Holmes regarded him coolly, motioning toward the chair opposite. "Father Silver, I presume. Sit, and let us hear what brings a man of faith to a den of deduction." As I poured the tea, Holmes rose to his feet and offered a handshake. His eyes, I noticed, did not meet our guest's face, but darted briefly downward, pausing at the scuffed shoes with foreign mud still clinging to the heels, the frayed stitching along one sleeve, the fingernails clean but unevenly trimmed. "Milk and sugar, Father?" Holmes asked mildly. "Just milk," the priest replied. "Of course," Holmes said, seating himself once more. But something in his expression told me he had already formed a private hypothesis. The man cleared his throat and began to speak in a low, cautious voice. Holmes, reaching for his pipe, leaned toward me and murmured almost inaudibly, "Embassies, Watson, are where truth goes to hide under flags." And with that, the game, I knew, had begun. "My name," the man said, his voice low and laced with accent, "is Father Luis Silva. I am attached to the Portuguese embassy in Grosvenor Square." Holmes, now fully upright in his chair, regarded him with polite interest, the fingertips of his long hands pressed together in his customary pose. "And what brings you to Baker Street, father?" The man hesitated, eyes flitting once toward the hearth and then back again. "A matter that demands great discretion. One of our junior attachés, Miguel Domingos, is missing. He has not been seen for 2 days. The matter has political delicacies. The ambassador wishes no scandal." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you have come not on behalf of the ambassador, but on your own initiative?" The man shifted. "Yes. I fear something untoward may have occurred." "I see," said Holmes. "Then let us begin by separating what you fear from what you know." "Señor Domingos," said Silva, "attended a reception at the embassy 2 evenings ago. He left rather early, citing a headache. Since then, his rooms have been untouched, and he has made no contact with colleagues or family." "You are certain of this?" Holmes asked. "Yes. I inquired discreetly with his landlord and his usual haunts." "And yet," said Holmes, "you withhold the name of the landlord, the time he departed, and the identity of any guest who may have spoken to him that night." The priest blinked behind his smoked lenses. "You must forgive me. We are under strict instruction to limit disclosure." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A curious notion that secrecy might aid recovery. But proceed." "There were rumours of an acquaintance with an Englishwoman. I do not know her name. A diplomatic man with private company. And yet you're here, not the ambassador himself. Why?" The man inclined his head slightly. "Because I believe Señor Domingos is in danger, not simply absent." "I wonder," said Holmes after a pause, "whether you find the epistle to the Ephesians as fascinating in the Vulgate as in the King James." The man tilted his head. "It is a rich text." Holmes offered a thin smile. "And yet not many favour the phrase Principatus Potestates unless they've translated it directly." "I studied in Coimbra," said Silva cautiously. "I imagine so," Holmes murmured. "And tell me, how did you mark the feast of St. Anthony last month?" "It was a quiet observance." "Indeed. Curious that the Portuguese embassy did not hold its customary mass." There was a flicker of something in the man's eyes. Irritation, perhaps, but it passed quickly, replaced by a mask of serenity. Holmes said nothing further, but I saw the corner of his mouth tighten. As the interview wore on, I found myself increasingly uneasy. The man spoke in the tones of a priest, but seemed devoid of the calm one expects from men of the cloth. His answers, when not evasive, were oddly structured, as if rehearsed. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Was Señor Domingos ever known to receive unusual parcels?" "Not that I recall." "Did he often leave the embassy alone?" "He valued solitude." "Was he in correspondence with anyone outside diplomatic circles?" A pause. "Perhaps a cousin in Braga." "A cousin with no name?" "I forget it." Holmes offered no comment. I, however, could not help but scribble a note beneath my own. "He remembers too little or too carefully." Holmes rose and retrieved a small volume from the shelf. "And was Señor Domingos in the habit of attending confession?" The man did not answer. He merely adjusted his collar and looked at the door. Holmes handed him the book, ostensibly to verify a date, but I saw his true purpose. As the man took it, his cassock sleeve pulled slightly back, revealing a narrow scar just above the wrist, half-healed and badly tended. Holmes took note with a flicker of the eyes. "Interesting hands," he remarked. "A scholar's fingers. Ink-stained, but not in the manner of sermon writing. No callus on the 3rd digit, so not a frequent penman. And yet, a tremor." The man quickly lowered the book. "Have you travelled recently, Father?" Holmes asked. "A visit to Portsmouth, briefly. Portsmouth mud would explain the staining on your boots, but not the trace of volcanic dust near the sole. That speaks of Madeira." The man said nothing. I find it curious, Holmes went on, that a man so meticulously dressed should wear boots a size too small, and stranger still, a priest who flinches at the word confession. The silence between them hung heavy. Holmes merely tapped the armrest with one finger, then asked gently, "Is it fear that brings you here, or guilt?" The man's knuckles whitened around his hat. As our guest shifted in his seat, the cassock opened slightly at the hem, and I glimpsed the dull glint of something beneath. Metallic, square-edged. Holmes saw it too, for I noticed the faint narrowing of his eyes. "A crucifix," I ventured, attempting levity. "Always," said Silver, adjusting his robe quickly, but the movement was too practiced, the concealment too swift. Holmes offered a mild smile. "A comforting relic. Many men of faith carry them." "Indeed," Silver said. "It gives strength." "Yes," Holmes agreed softly. "Strength or protection, depending on the circumstance." He let the comment hang, saying nothing more of it. But I knew Holmes had registered that shape beneath the cassock. It was not a crucifix, not unless Rome had begun issuing cults. Still, Holmes' tone remained warm, almost indulgent, and he rose to indicate the close of the interview. "You've given us much to consider, Father. We shall look into your concerns." The priest nodded quickly and turned toward the door. Holmes's gaze followed him with unmistakable calculation. When the front door finally closed behind our guest, I turned to Holmes. "There's something unnatural about him," I said. "He is either the most frightened priest I've ever seen, or not a priest at all." Holmes nodded absently, eyes still fixed on the empty chair. "Well?" I asked. He reached for his pipe and lit it with deliberate slowness. "The church makes many converts, my dear Watson," he said at last, "some more recent than others." Then he lapsed into silence, the smoke curling upward as the fog outside thickened. It was barely noon the following day when Holmes and I found ourselves ascending the marble steps of the Portuguese embassy, our cards bearing the fictional insignia of the Continental Gazette, tucked discreetly within Holmes's inner pocket. He had deemed it prudent to assume the role of a travelling journalist with a penchant for foreign diplomacy, while I played the part of his clumsy but well-meaning illustrator, an arrangement that did little to flatter my medical training but seemed to amuse Holmes greatly. "We are seekers of news, Watson," he had whispered as we approached the heavy double doors, "and no soil yields it more richly than that which men try to keep covered." Inside, we were greeted with cautious courtesy. A steward in stiff collar and soft shoes led us through echoing halls scented faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Holmes adopted an urbane air, making vague references to Lisbon's recent unrest and the fascinating cultural traditions of the embassy's chaplaincy. When we were ushered into a lacquered reception room, Holmes's eyes darted quickly, not at the paintings or busts, but at the doors, locks, rugs, and shadows between diplomatic smiles. It was a Colonel Rocher who met us, a silver-haired man with a civil manner and the tight lips of one who has rehearsed his evasions. "We are not in the habit," he said in near-fluent English, "of discussing internal matters with foreign press." Holmes smiled. "But surely, Colonel, a junior attaché's sabbatical is hardly a matter of state." Rocher inclined his head. "Senor Domingos is on extended leave, quite voluntary, nothing unusual. And the reason for his absence? Personal. And his destination? Unrecorded." Holmes chuckled softly. "Most mysterious. One might almost think he had vanished entirely." Rocher's expression did not change, but the corners of his eyes stiffened. "That would be an erroneous assumption, Mr. Lawton," a name Holmes had borrowed for the day. Holmes bowed. "Of course." As we were led back to the foyer, Holmes whispered, "Note how they answer questions not by denying, but by placing them in quotation marks. That's how governments lie without lying, Watson." Outside, the embassy door closed behind us with a quiet but definite finality. We made our way not back to Baker Street, but to a small boarding house off Warwick Square, where Holmes had reason to believe Domingos had once lodged before embassy housing had been assigned. A discreet word to the landlady, and curiously, a golden sovereign, secured us entrance to the young man's former quarters, which had been left untouched out of what the woman called a sense of unease. The room was small, immaculately kept, and curiously lifeless. Holmes moved quickly, fingers trailing over surfaces, glancing at the edges of drawers rather than inside them. The wardrobe still contained 3 shirts, neatly folded. His passport lay open on the desk beside a pair of rosary beads, uncoiled and laid out as if once used daily, and then abruptly abandoned. But it was the fireplace that drew Holmes's interest. Kneeling, he retrieved a charred scrap of paper from the grate. He blew gently on the ash. The writing was smudged, but part of a line remained. "Cannot continue. They would kill me if—" He folded it carefully. "Stage-managed disappearance," he murmured. "Meaning?" "Someone wished us to believe he left voluntarily. But people fleeing rarely take the time to destroy only part of a farewell." I said nothing, but felt the air in the room turn suddenly colder. Holmes now turned his attention to the desk, where a half-filled wineglass still stood beside an overturned inkwell. He sniffed the rim, peered into the bowl, then tilted it slightly in his gloved hand. A faint ring of grey ash clung to the interior. "Cuban," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Domingos was a smoker?" I asked. "A rare indulgence, according to the maid," Holmes replied. "And even then, only the native Portuguese variety, thin, dry and hand-rolled. This, however," he held the glass up to the light, "is the coarse black leaf of the Havana wrapper cut by a long-bladed guillotine, which suggests that someone else drank from this glass, someone who wished to appear as Señor Domingos, yet knew him not well enough to mimic his vices. A double? Perhaps, or a crude impersonation for the benefit of a witness. If so, I dare say it was done in haste and desperation." I glanced at the untouched passport on the writing table. Then the disappearance was not just an escape, but a performance. Holmes smiled faintly. "Bravo, Watson. The audience was never meant to applaud. It was meant to forget." We descended the narrow service stair at the back of the house, where Holmes had requested a word with the housemaid, an anxious girl named Isadora, who twisted her apron in her hands as she answered in broken English. "You worked for Señor Domingos?" "Si, sir. I cleaned for him every Thursday." "Did he ever receive visitors?" Only once a week. Always same hour. A lady." Holmes leaned forward. "Describe her." "She was tall, English, hair like chestnut, never smiled. She waited until I was away before she came." "Did you hear a name?" Isadora shook her head. "But one time she dropped paper, a note. I see it say, Kensington." Holmes offered a coin. "Did you see anything else?" Isadora hesitated. "She wore gloves, always, even inside." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And did Señor Domingos seem afraid of her?" "Afraid? No. Sad." As we turned to leave, Holmes remarked, "Love letters and revolutions, Watson. Both are kept secret until it is too late." It was I who spotted it, wedged behind the andiron, half swallowed by ash and forgotten coal. "Holmes," I said, crouching, "something remains." I handed it to him gently. The fragment was scorched along 2 edges, but the ink, though faded, was still legible across a single line. "Cannot continue. They would kill me if—" Holmes took it silently and folded it into his pocket without a word. "Domingos wrote it?" I asked. "Possibly," he said. "But the phrasing is curious. They would kill me. Not he or she. That suggests more than personal fear. It suggests an organization. A conspiracy." He nodded once. "And yet," I said, "why destroy only this much of it?" "Because," Holmes said, rising, "someone else tried to finish the job and was interrupted. He tapped the mantel once with the stem of his pipe. Fear, Watson, makes men burn what they should send, and keep what they should burn. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes withdrew a slim, leather-bound travel journal from the pocket of his coat. It had belonged to Domingos and had been tucked beneath the lining of a false-bottomed drawer. Remarkable what servants will overlook, Holmes said dryly. He turned to a page midway through. Portuguese script, fluent, fast, educated. Observe the flourished the long tail on the as. He produced the anonymous letter we had received the day before. He wears the cloth, but not the conscience. I leaned forward. You see it too, Watson. The difference in slope, I said slowly. The second hand is trying to appear Portuguese. Exactly. But it is not native. It mimics accent as one mimics character. Holmes laid the two samples side by side. And yet the ink, the pressure, the habitual hesitation before the W, that is common to both. You mean? I mean that Domingos wrote both, one in his voice, the other in disguise. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers once more beneath his chin. My dear Watson, he said, let us now consider the truly audacious possibility. I raised an eyebrow. What if Domingos has not vanished at all? What if he sits in Baker Street even now, in cassock and spectacles, and we have spoken to him without knowing? You mean silver? I mean precisely that. But he feared for Domingos. He came to ask for help. Indeed, and if he is Domingos, then he has created for himself the most secure disguise possible, that of a man too holy to question. I was speechless. Holmes continued. The slight accent shift, the false script, the careful evasions, all point to a man playing two parts. He faked his own disappearance to survive something larger. Assassination or exposure. The difference is academic when the stakes are death. And as the fire crackled low, I could not help but shiver, not from cold, but from the terrible elegance of the lie. It was late that evening, the air thick with pipe smoke and speculation, when Holmes finally turned to me with that sharp gleam in his eye that always preceded revelation. You recall, Watson, he said, the note that claimed he wore the cloth but not the conscience. Vividly. Well, I have now the conscience, Watson, and the cloth. He rose, walked to the bureau, and withdrew the letter left unsigned. Compare this hand with Domingos's travel diary. They are one and the same. Then it was Domingos himself who wrote it. Precisely. Our good Father Silver is no priest, but Señor Domingos in disguise. I must confess, I felt a rush of both admiration and unease. But he came to you seeking help. Why conceal his identity? Because, my dear fellow, the hunter does not seek the shepherd, but the lamb. Holmes crossed to the window and glanced out. He knew he was being pursued, so he fashioned the only mask his enemies would never question. And he played the role remarkably well. Yes, Holmes said. But even actors tire, Watson, especially when the stage is set for death. Holmes summoned our false priest the following morning with the promise of discretion. The man who entered Baker Street no longer clung to his piety, but removed his spectacles and cassock with visible relief. Without prompting, he sat and spoke in his native voice. My name, he said, is Miguel Domingos, and I have not come to betray my country, but to save it from shame. We listened in silence as he explained that several weeks prior, he had overheard a conversation between two senior officials behind the east wing of the embassy. They spoke of crates moving through diplomatic channels, untouched by customs, protected by flag and privilege. But they were not documents, he said. They were arms, small, hidden, wrapped in false scrolls and wax seals. I saw one with my own eyes, left open by mistake in the consular hall. Who was present? Holmes asked. Domingos hesitated. I dare not speak their names yet, but I will say this. It was not a rogue action. It was organized. And you feared they would silence you? I asked. I do not fear it, Dr. Watson, he said quietly. I expect it. Holmes nodded solemnly. And that, Senor Domingos, is why you chose the confessional over the courtroom. It began, Domingos said, with a threat that was not spoken aloud, but left upon my pillow. He drew from his inner coat a folded handkerchief. Inside was a silver cufflink, plain, save for the insignia of the Portuguese coat of arms. No one in the embassy wears such links openly anymore, he continued. It was a signal, a message. They knew I had seen something. Holmes studied the object, then returned it with care. And so you vanished. I could not flee openly. I had neither allies nor assurances. The embassy watches every departure. And the cassock? I asked. I purchased it in Brixton, he said, not without a trace of irony. It was the only costume that might let me move unseen among those who wished me dead. Holmes tapped his pipe once. An effective disguise, too effective perhaps. Domingos sighed. It allowed me entry here, but it also prevents me from returning. I cannot go to my embassy, and I cannot stay hidden forever. His hands trembled slightly. That is why I came. To you. Holmes rose and walked to the shelf where he kept his foreign dossiers. He drew out a folder bound in green twine and untied it briskly. There is a name, he said, which recurs in Lisbon, Paris, and Berlin. A name spoken softly in embassies and shouted in radical cafes. He laid out several clippings. Each bore the same title, Carvalho. Sebastian Carvalho, Holmes said. Former attaché in Vienna. Promoted to diplomatic advisor under ambiguous circumstances. His published treatises border on sedition, cloaked in eloquence, of course. Domingos nodded grimly. I have heard the whispers. Carvalho is persuasive. More than that, Holmes replied. He is a theorist with access, and if I am correct, the architect behind these diplomatic smuggling efforts. And the woman, I asked, the one from South Kensington? Holmes tapped the ashtray once. A courier, possibly an agent, too careful for a mistress, too frequent for a servant. I believe she answers to Carvalho. Domingos looked up sharply. You cannot expose him without proof. Holmes's smile was wintry. Which is why we must not expose him. Then what? We bait him, said Holmes, and make him reveal himself. Holmes tapped the side of his pipe thoughtfully, his brow drawn not in certainty, but in concentration. A rare and telling expression in my old friend. Carvalho is a sharp blade, he said at last. But blades do not choose whom they cut. You believe he's not acting alone? I am convinced of it. He is too visible, too verbose. Men of his kind rarely engineer operations this delicate. Domingos looked startled. But he gave the orders. He controls the ports. And yet, Holmes said, you still live. That remark startled us both, though Holmes spoke it with his usual detachment. Were Carvalho at the centre, you would already be floating face down in the Thames, your cassock still buttoned. He rose. No, my dear Watson, there is a spider deeper in the web, one whose face we have not seen, whose name is not yet spoken, someone who whispers in embassies and moves pawns like bishops. Do you suspect anyone? Holmes smiled faintly. I suspect silence, and where silence reigns, power hides. The following morning, Holmes rose early and sent a series of telegrams so precise in their phrasing and cryptic in content that even the clerk at the telegraph office raised a curious brow. One was addressed to an obscure address in the Alfama district of Lisbon, another, astonishingly, to a French prefecture in Marseille. The third bore only the initials M.H. and was handed to a special courier. What are you hoping to learn? I asked him as we returned to Baker Street. Patterns, Watson, he said. The language of conspiracy is numbers and intervals. Let us see if they align. Meanwhile, I had been entrusted with a more pedestrian task. Visiting a certain antiquarian bookshop in Shoreditch where Domingos had reportedly spent his idle hours. The shopkeeper, a a balding man with tea-stained fingers, recalled the young attaché's visits clearly. Always asked for atlases, Central Europe mostly, but he never bought, just looked, muttered, and took notes. I relayed this to Holmes that evening. He was tracing trade routes, Holmes muttered, perhaps arms movements, or escape lines. Escape? Holmes gave a dry smile. Every man who studies maps in peacetime prepares for war, either to make it or to run from it. The next morning found Holmes unusually active, his movements quick, his answers brief. He wrote 3 letters, gave instructions to Lestrade, and spoke to a man in an alley who, to my eyes, resembled more a chimney sweep than any honest informant. "Are we preparing for war, Holmes?" I asked wryly. "No, Watson," he replied, lacing his gloves. "We are setting a trap, a quiet one." "For whom?" "Anyone foolish enough to walk into it." He summoned Domingos later that day and gave him a small folded paper. "Tonight, docks at Mill Lane, 12 sharp. Come alone and wear the cloth." Domingos blanched but nodded. "You will come too, Watson," Holmes added, almost as an afterthought. "But do not bring your revolver. We are guests tonight, not hosts." I raised an eyebrow. "And what is this meeting exactly?" Holmes smiled in that maddening way of his. "It is," he said, "a net woven with mirrors. What is real, they will not trust. But what reflects their fear, they shall believe." As we prepared to leave for the docks, Holmes stood at the mantel, adjusting the cuffs of his coat with what might, in another man, be mistaken for nerves. "You seem unusually thoughtful," I remarked. Holmes gave a short laugh. "Thoughtful, yes, and not without reason." He turned to me. "What I am about to do, Watson, is not a proud act. It relies upon deception, risk, and the exploitation of one man's fear." "Domingos?" Holmes nodded. "I have baited a trap with a prayer and a lie. Whether it catches the mouse or the cat, I cannot yet say." "And if it fails?" Holmes glanced at the window. The fog pressed against the panes like a living thing. "Then we shall know something else. Namely, that the enemy reads more than scripture and fears more than bullets." He took up his coat. "Come, Watson, the theatre awaits. Let us see who dares to play God in the Knave of Shadows." Holmes had a peculiar fondness for irony in his stagecraft. When he informed me that the rendezvous would take place in a deconsecrated riverside chapel off Mill Lane, I raised my brow but said nothing. I had long since ceased to question the theatrical flourishes of his intellect. "It was once known as the Chapel of St. Hilary," he remarked that morning over toast. "Defunct these 20 years, a place of music and incense, now home to damp walls and illicit cargo." "Why there?" I asked. "Because no one goes to a broken altar unless they've something to bury, and because confession, Watson, is best extracted where the acoustics flatter lies." The building itself was narrow and crumbling, its Gothic arch half swallowed by ivy and neglect, yet its emptiness lent it an eerie solemnity, a place where even silence felt intrusive. Holmes inspected the interior with his lantern and nodded. "It will do. A choir loft for me, shadow for Lestrade, and a nave for the performance." "Performance?" I said. "Indeed. Tonight we summon devils in priest's clothing and offer them a lamb." He looked toward the doorway, his voice almost kind. "Though this lamb may prove less docile than expected." That evening, Domingo stood once more in the cassock he had so recently abandoned, the false collar fastened at his throat with trembling fingers. He looked pale beneath the dim light, his hands twitching despite Holmes' assurances. "You've done this before," Holmes said gently, adjusting the man's cuffs. "Tonight is no different." "It is different," Domingos replied hoarsely. "Tonight I expect to die." "Which is why," Holmes said, straightening, "you must walk slowly and speak less than usual." The instruction puzzled Domingos. "Why?" "Because," Holmes answered, "men are more easily fooled by silence than speech. A single word may give you away, but a bowed head, a measured gait, that they expect." Domingos nodded, but I saw fear in his eyes. Holmes offered him a small silver cross, oddly aged. Carry this. It is not blessed, but it may ward off what truly hunts you. And if they test me, Domingos whispered. If they see through it, Holmes placed a hand on his shoulder. Then speak with conviction. Even liars fear those who believe. As Domingos turned to leave, Holmes's gaze followed him. And remember, this role you were born to play. We arrived at the chapel just after 11. The fog was low, curling around our feet like a living thing. Lestrade was already there with 2 plainclothes constables, men I had seen before at the yard, notable for their silence and steel resolve. They'll not speak, Holmes said approvingly, not even if asked. Lestrade, rubbing his hands for warmth, gave a tight nod. This had better not turn into one of your parlour games, Holmes. If it does, Holmes replied, the stakes will be blood. He pointed out their positions. One behind the ruined font near the south wall, another crouched beneath the pulpit steps, and Lestrade himself to lurk behind the organ casing. You'll wait for the signal, Holmes said. And what will that be? You'll know it. The inspector grunted. If this silver fellow bolts, let him, Holmes said. You'll not be chasing a man tonight, Lestrade. You'll be catching shadows. Domingos arrived shortly after, gliding through the side door like a spectre. Holmes gave him a single nod. Then he climbed silently into the choir loft, and we took our places in the dark, awaiting whatever sin dared knock at the chapel's forgotten door. It was nearly midnight when the door creaked open once more, and a tall figure stepped into the nave. I recognized him at once from Holmes's clippings. Sebastian Carvalho. He wore a dark coat, hands gloved, hat tilted forward. His steps were confident, echoing faintly against the stone, and he paused only when he was 3 feet from Domingos. "My dear Miguel," he said, voice oiled with familiarity. "You've had us terribly worried." Domingos gave a shallow nod but said nothing. "No need for words," Carvalho continued. "Not here. Come. There's a carriage outside. Warmth. A brandy, perhaps, and answers." Domingos did not move. Carvalho smiled. "Still playing the pious role, I see. But saints, Miguel, do not hide in broken chapels." He reached into his coat and drew out a letter, waving it gently. "A request for leave, signed by you, delivered to the ambassador yesterday. Rather convincing, don't you think?" Still Domingos held his silence. Carvalho's smile faded slightly. "You've always been clever," he said more softly. "Too clever. But cleverness, you see, Miguel, is only valuable if it knows when to stop." He stepped closer. "Come now, one step. That's all I need." Domingos tilted his head slightly, waiting, measuring, and from above, Holmes leaned forward, tense, focused, as if reading the final line of an unread play. Before Domingos could answer, the chapel door creaked once more, and from the fog emerged another figure. A woman, slight of frame and dressed in the simple garb of a housekeeper. Her step was quick and purposeful. She carried a bundle in one hand and what appeared to be a worn satchel in the other. "Forgive me," she said in accented English. "I was told to fetch him." Carvalho did not turn, but a flicker passed across his face. Domingos, meanwhile, stepped back instinctively. Holmes's eyes narrowed from above. The woman drew closer, too close, and from beneath her shawl, something flashed. Steel. It was no longer a satchel in her hand, but the hilt of a stiletto, and with a fluid motion she raised it, aiming directly for Domingos's chest. What happened next occurred so quickly I cannot be certain of the order. I heard Holmes's voice cry, "Now!" from above, followed by the rush of feet. Lestrade and his men springing from the shadows. Domingos staggered back, the blade missing him by inches. Carvalho turned with a snarl, reaching into his coat, but Lestrade had him before the pistol cleared his pocket. The woman fought like a wildcat, spitting and cursing in Portuguese. But Holmes descended like thunder from the choir loft, seizing her wrist and wrenching the blade free. She screamed, but it was too late. The trap had sprung. The cry of "now" had scarcely left Holmes's lips when he vanished from the choir loft above. In a flash that seemed at once both reckless and premeditated, he vaulted from the gallery rail and landed hard upon the nave's flagstones, his coat trailing like a black wing behind him. The chapel, for a breathless instant, became the stage of a violent liturgy. The blade skittered across the stone, knocked loose by Holmes's strike upon the woman's wrist. She snarled in Portuguese, her hands clawing at him with more rage than precision. It took all of Holmes's considerable strength and balance to keep her at bay, until Lestrade arrived to secure her with his manacles. Carvalho, meanwhile, had drawn a small caliber pistol, a weapon of Belgian make, Holmes would later note. But he was too slow by half. One of the constables struck his hand with a truncheon, and the weapon clattered to the ground. He lunged for it, but the other officer pinned him from behind, wresting him into submission against the chapel's cold altar. Through it all, Holmes remained curiously serene, as though the pandemonium around him were no more than a chessboard whose outcome he had already calculated. His eyes swept the room, taking in every motion, every gasp, every misplaced footstep. He spoke only once during the melee, as Carvalho spat a curse. "Language, sir," Holmes murmured mildly. "You are still in a house of God." The stone cross that once crowned the chapel's chancel now lay toppled in a far corner, yet it was beneath that relic of forgotten sanctity that Carvalho and the woman were finally subdued. Lestrade, breathless and red-faced, barked orders to his men as they pinned the pair in turn. First Carvalho, his limbs flailing in impotent protest, and then the woman, who fought with the desperation of one who has no flag to fall back upon. She scratched, bit, and screamed in a torrent of several languages: Portuguese, French, something Slavic perhaps. All of them poured forth in fury and ruin. It took 2 men to hold her, and one bore scratches deep enough to stain his cuff. Holmes, ever the island in the storm, merely brushed dust from his lapel and retrieved the silver cross that had been flung to the floor in the chaos. He turned it over once in his fingers before slipping it silently into his coat pocket. Domingos, if it was Domingos, stood rigid, not moving, eyes lowered like a man awaiting judgment. Lestrade turned to Holmes at last. "Well, that's that, I suppose." "Not quite," Holmes replied, his voice smooth as still water. "The players are in custody, yes, but the curtain has not yet fallen." And with that, he turned toward the silent figure in the cassock. Holmes approached the man in the cassock, who remained unnaturally still, his hands folded as though in prayer. Then, with a nod from Holmes, the figure reached up and removed the collar. It was not Domingos. The face that emerged was younger, clean-shaven, and possessed of a quiet, theatrical pride. He gave a small bow to the room, as though his role were ending with the fall of the curtain. "This," said Holmes, "is Mr. Alcott, a character actor of some minor repute at the Surrey Theatre. He has been in my employ for 3 days." Lestrade blinked. "Then where is the real fellow?" "On a steamer bound for Madeira," Holmes replied. "He left 2 nights ago under the name of a Portuguese merchant. You'll find his affidavit and statement enclosed with my telegram to the Foreign Office." "But why this charade?" "Because, Lestrade," Holmes said with a smile, "Domingos was the mouse they baited, but not the one we needed to dangle. A known man draws suspicion. A vanished one draws pursuit." He turned to the stunned woman, whose eyes had widened in realization. "You, madam, chased a phantom." Holmes gave the actor a nod of thanks. "Well done, Mr. Alcott. You may keep the cassock." Lestrade, ever eager to close his ledger, demanded the woman's name. Holmes, however, spoke first, his voice almost contemplative. "She is known in Vienna as Marta Vichova," he said, "in Budapest as Marika Vesela, and in The Hague under at least 2 other identities. She is no housekeeper, but a radical of the old school, trained in poison and pamphlet, fluent in 6 tongues, loyal to none. The woman hissed something I did not catch. Holmes inclined his head slightly. "You mistake me," he said. "I do not condemn your cause, only your methods. You could have been a diplomat. You chose instead to become a dagger in a drawer." Lestrade glanced at him. "And the embassy?" "They knew of her," Holmes replied, "but found her useful until she drew blood too publicly, hence the desperate silence." He turned away from her and toward the ruined nave. The candlelight had died, and with it the heat of action. The chapel stood once more in stillness. "Some revolutions," Holmes murmured, "begin not with a speech, but with a whisper and a blade." And thus the spider's web, drawn so tightly in foreign silk, had at last been pierced by a needle from Baker Street. We returned to Baker Street that evening beneath a sleet-silvered sky. Our collars turned against the wind, and our thoughts still adrift in the damp silence of that forgotten chapel. Holmes said little during the cab ride. He sat hunched in his overcoat, his gaze fixed somewhere between the horse's rump and the lamplight beyond the fogged pane. I knew that look well. It was the gaze of a mind rehearsing its own theatre. Once inside, he made directly for the fireplace and struck a match with an impatient flick. The flame caught on the paper and the firewood crackled into life. He reached for his pipe, the old cherrywood one with the teeth marks, and filled it with an absent-minded air. "Watson," said he at last, settling into his chair, "do you recall the Jesuit maxim, 'Give me the child until he is 7, and I will show you the man'?" "I do. Why?" "Because today a man pretended to be a priest, and failed before he had even crossed the threshold. He did not elaborate immediately, but merely stared into the flames as if waiting for the proper time to lower the curtain on his little play. That moment, I knew, had not yet arrived." Holmes puffed once or twice upon his pipe, then leaned forward as though laying out pieces on a chessboard. "Consider, Watson, the manner of his entry. When Father Silver arrived at our rooms, he did not bow his head at the crucifix in the hall. That, in itself, may seem minor, but to a man raised in the cloth, a reflex not easily forsaken." I nodded, drawing my chair nearer the warmth. "Next, his hands. Immaculate. No traces of ink, nor the faint discoloration one often finds in men of the altar who habitually handle ancient texts and silver liturgy." I shook his hand, and it was smooth as a bank clerk's. Not the skin of one accustomed to village coffins or charcoal chapels. I remarked that I had found him rather soft-spoken. "Too soft," Holmes replied, "a calculated timidity designed to disarm. But when he spoke Portuguese, there it broke. His accent bore the distinct cadence of the Protestant North, Braga, perhaps, not Lisbon, and his Latin was, how shall I put it, unclean. He blessed himself in a left-handed motion and said Dominum Nostrum when he meant Dominus Noster. No true priest trained in Coimbra would blunder so. And yet, I said, he had me convinced. Precisely why I allowed him to enter. Sometimes, Watson, one must let the curtain rise before one reveals that the actor has forgotten his lines." Holmes rose and crossed to the sideboard, where he retrieved a small envelope. From it, he produced a square of linen paper with a few smudges upon it. "Cigar ash," he said simply, "brought to me by a porter at the embassy who has a curious interest in botany and an unwholesome fear of priests. He knew I would be interested. He handed it to me, and I examined it. A faint, reddish-grey smear near the corner. It was found on a glass of red wine," Holmes continued, "in Domingos's own quarters. Odd that. The attaché was known to drink port, never claret, and certainly not while smoking a black Trabuco cigar. Yet there it was, a nearly full glass, and the ash still fresh enough to curl. But what does it signify? That Domingos never drank it. Someone else had been there, Someone hoping to leave a sign of leisure. A last glass, as though the man had vanished into thin air, mid-drink. Holmes's gaze narrowed. But people rarely disappear with half their laundry still hanging in the wardrobe. So it was staged. Poorly, Holmes said. Like most diplomatic theatre, Watson, half act, half lie. He turned again to the fire. From the start, I suspected Domingos was in danger. The false disappearance confirmed it. The question was whether he fled or was being prepared for removal by someone else. For days, I had observed Holmes dashing off telegrams in bursts of activity, to Paris, to Madrid, to some nameless contact in Hamburg. I had, I confess, assumed it to be one of his more eccentric diversions. I was mistaken. Holmes reached now for his leather folio, from which he withdrew a small stack of cable returns. I needed confirmation, he said, that certain items had moved across borders, quietly, in sealed diplomatic crates. Arms, I guessed. He nodded. 6 rifles, of a pattern used by the gendarmerie of Porto, declared as cultural antiquities for embassy display, and a crate marked rosary sets, which weighed precisely the same as a crate of percussion fuses. He placed one telegram in my hand. It was from a port clerk in Calais. Notice how they arrived by diplomatic pouch, but left again under consular seal. A sleight of hand only the truly reckless would attempt. But how does Domingos fit into this? He discovered it, or at least enough to trouble the smugglers. That's why they replaced him with a pretender. Had we not intervened, the real Domingos would have disappeared for good. Into a river, perhaps, or an alpine crevasse. Holmes sat back and exhaled, the firelight glinting in his eyes. Not all crimes begin with murder, Watson. Some begin with a parcel, a stamp, and a silence too carefully kept. As Holmes tapped the last ashes from his pipe, I remarked upon the curious choice of setting for the climax of the affair. A crumbling chapel, Holmes. And in such theatrics, could you not have apprehended them in a drawing-room with tea? He offered a rare smile. But you see, Watson, the place itself was half the trap. I must have looked puzzled, for he leaned forward. The embassy, the rosary, the cassock, every symbol they employed was borrowed from sanctity. And yet behind each lay deception, faith reduced to camouflage, ritual used to smuggle arms, and a priesthood impersonated by mercenaries. So I chose a ruined church, hollow, beautiful, and false, as the place to draw out those who had traded incense for powder. He paused. The irony was too perfect to ignore. What better theatre for exposing corrupted rites than a place once sacred, now abandoned? I was struck by the coolness of his logic, as ever touched by the strange poetry which surfaced when he least intended it. But what if they hadn't come? He shrugged. Then they were never worth catching. I could not help but feel the echo of those bells in my chest, hollow, distant, and yet damning. Holmes had summoned them into a tomb of their own making, and in that place, their true confessions had begun before a congregation of law. As we cleared our glasses, I remarked once more upon the uncanny likeness of Father Silver to the missing attaché. It was a masterstroke of disguise, said I. He had Domingos's gait, his voice, even the slight catch in his left foot. Holmes allowed himself a look of mild amusement. That is because the man had studied him, rather obsessively. You knew him then? A minor actor of middling skill and excellent mimicry. I found him in a Limehouse tavern last winter, mumbling Hamlet to a stray dog. He owed me a favour. I blinked. So you planted the impostor, but why? To smoke out the real traitors, Watson. If they believed Domingos had escaped and returned, publicly, foolishly, and in full priestly attire, they would panic. And panicked people make mistakes. You used a man's faith as bait. I used a man's absence, Holmes corrected. The cassock was merely wardrobe. But suppose they had seen through him. They nearly did. The woman grew suspicious. But that, too, was part of the design. He stood and stretched. Even the best deceivers forget they can be deceived. As I sat in astonishment, I could not help but marvel once more at the sheer theatre of it all. Holmes had staged a divine comedy and made his audience confess. I turned to the window, lost in thought, and said aloud, "It's strange to think it all began with a priest in distress." Holmes, from his armchair, gave a short laugh, not unkind, but brisk. "Not a priest in distress, Watson, a man hiding beneath a stolen cloth." I turned to face him. "You mean to say—" "I mean to say that the figure who first approached us under the name of Father Silver was never clergy. He was a courier, nothing more. His orders were to initiate a trail of false leads, all designed to shield the real operation. He played his part well enough to fool most, but not you." Holmes inclined his head modestly. I noticed he avoided all mention of specific orders, could not identify the presiding Bishop of Lisbon, and flinched when I mentioned the Book of Tobit. "And yet we took the case." "Of course we did, because the lie was clumsy, and clumsy lies are often pasted over larger, more dangerous truths." He rose and began to pace. "You see, Watson, I do not concern myself with whether a man wears a collar, but whether he avoids certain streets, omits key names, and insists on candlelight in a room full of gas. That, to me, is faith. Faith in shadows." I watched him, fascinated as ever. The case had seemed a tangle of clerical nonsense, but to Holmes it was a ritual unmasking performed beneath the guise of reverence. We sat in silence for a time. Outside, the fog had thickened, and the bells of Westminster rang with a sound I found neither cheerful nor mournful, but oddly fitting. Holmes stirred, and with a tone of weary amusement said, "There is a curious symmetry, Watson. Churches and embassies. Both are sacred to their own tribes. Both issue declarations in Latin, wear robes, and demand silence at the wrong moments. You think them alike?" "I think them mirrors," Holmes replied. "One reflects the soul of a people, the other reflects its lies." He gestured to the telegrams still scattered across the carpet. "Behind every embassy wall, a quiet war unfolds, not with sabres, but with documents, not with armies, but with signatures and silk gloves. One bribes a mayor, another poisons a journal, all in the name of peace." "And Domingos?" Holmes grew uncharacteristically still. Domingos was a man with a conscience, and that made him dangerous. He saw through the theatre and tried to leave the play. He leaned back, eyes half-lidded. In a world where masks are worn by habit, the man who speaks plainly is always the greatest threat. The clock ticked. Holmes did not smile, but there was something in his voice, a weary respect, perhaps. "One honest man," he murmured, "can unseat a dozen hypocrites." The rain had returned by the time we reached Baker Street. It drummed lightly upon the panes, a rhythmic, almost apologetic tapping, as though London itself were attempting contrition. Holmes, for his part, remained silent, his features drawn in that peculiar manner I'd come to associate with an unfinished thought, or an emotion not easily named. He took to his armchair without a word and struck a match. The pipe was lit, the long fingers steepled once more, and his gaze became fixed upon the dancing flames in the grate. I did not disturb him. There are times when Holmes, like some ancient oracle, descends into a kind of internal mist, and it is best not to speak until the fog clears. I occupied myself with sorting through the newspapers, though my eyes wandered more than they read. He smoked steadily, and in that comfortable silence, the true weight of what we had uncovered began to settle between us. At length, I could bear it no longer. "Holmes," I said, "you allowed the consulate to retain its dignity. No arrest, no public censure, no telegram to the Times. You let them slip away." He did not look at me, but I saw the muscles of his jaw shift slightly beneath the lamplight. "I had to wonder," I continued, "why you stayed your hand. You had them cornered. Why not expose it all?" He drew on his pipe and exhaled slowly. "Because the game, he said at last, was never meant for spectators. I waited for elaboration, but none came. Instead, he returned to the fire with the same blank intensity. The question hung in the room like smoke, not answered, not ignored, but absorbed. When he finally spoke, his tone was one of weary finality, because the truth, once international, becomes a burden, not a solution. I glanced up. You mean to say, I mean, he interrupted, that exposing such truths only causes nations to posture, diplomats to deny, and innocents to suffer. The machinery of states cannot digest confessions. It can only grind them into grievances. He leaned back, eyes distant. Let them whisper behind curtains. Let them shuffle papers and rewrite memos. But better that, Watson, than cannonades over an intercepted missive. I could not argue. The case had touched wires I hadn't even known existed, and Holmes, for all his cold logic, had chosen silence. That, I realised, was his final deduction. A silence fell once more, not the uneasy kind, but something gentler, like a wound dressing itself. Then, from somewhere far off, perhaps beyond the river, a bell began to toll. It was not loud, but the sound carried. Holmes did not stir. His face remained unreadable, the pipe now resting cool in his hand. For my part, the chime stirred an image I could not shake. That ruined chapel, the rasp of stone, the cold breath of betrayal. It tolled again, and I wondered whether it mourned the dead or warned the living. Holmes broke the stillness at last with a small grunt. "Next time, Watson," he said, rising to knock out his pipe. "Let us hope for a case that involves a real priest and a genuine prayer." I smiled despite myself. "You'd be disappointed, Holmes. Too little subterfuge in virtue." He raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps, but even a master of deduction occasionally craves simplicity." And with that, he turned toward the side table, where a new envelope had arrived in our absence. I chuckled, shaking my head as he slit the envelope with precise indifference. "From Mycroft," he murmured. How tiresomely predictable. But the contents gave him pause. His brows lifted, not with alarm, but with interest. "Well?" He handed me the note without comment. It was brief, signed in Mycroft's unmistakable hand, and beneath the seal, a single name was underlined. Doña Mercedes Ortega, daughter to the Spanish ambassador. Holmes tapped the letter against his palm. "It seems, Watson, that diplomacy breeds daughters as easily as secrets. And scandal?" His eyes sparkled faintly. "That, my dear fellow, remains to be seen." Outside, the bell tolled once more. Inside, the game resumed. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, as the last embers in the hearth crumbled to ash. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "the true danger was never the assassin in disguise, nor the gun beneath the cassock. It was the lie that wore the face of virtue. When trust is cloaked in piety, even the sharpest minds can falter." I nodded slowly, watching his profile catch the flicker of dying light. "And yet," I murmured, "you saw through it." "Only because I knew," Holmes said, "that sometimes the cleanest hands have never touched honest work." "What do you think was the single clue that truly gave the villain away? The hands, the blessing, or something even subtler?" I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy unravelling mysteries alongside Holmes, don't forget to subscribe for more cases like this, and share the story with fellow lovers of deduction.